Good evening.
Good evening.
We'll open the festivities with a little comment on this question. And the question is to the effect well, it has to do with our June letter in which I said that devoted students become immortalized, though sometimes martyred, because of their spiritual zeal and love of spiritual adventure. What do you mean by martyred? I presume there is no value in martyrdom. The presumption is all wrong. There's not only a value in martyrdom, it's an experience that cannot be avoided, and it is, of all things, the most beneficial experience in our spiritual progress. To begin with, you have heard teachers and practitioners may have said to you that you must not hate your problems, that they are your greatest blessings. You probably felt that that was some kind of a metaphysical cliche, and that so far as you're concerned, you just as well do without that particular form of blessing. But as a matter of fact, there is no way of achieving any degree of spiritual living without problems. No one in the history of all religious history has ever achieved even a tiny measure or grain of spiritual awareness without problems. Why? Well, physical health and physical wealth and happy human relationships may be something far different than spiritual demonstration. There are many, many people in the world who have animal health and who have dollar supply and even what they may call a happy life, or especially in these days of televisions when you don't have to think. Spiritual progress is only made by rising above physical life. That doesn't only mean the inharmonies and discords, the sins and diseases of physical life. One has to rise above human good. Otherwise, one is merely attaining the first part of a civilized life. Now let's go back and show you how this all began. The law came by Moses, and that means the law of the Ten Commandments and the dietetic laws and other such laws. But grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. In order to understand the infinite way at all, you will have to understand how it is that there is an infinite way, what brought it into existence. Before the days of Jesus Christ, in the Near East and what might be called the Western world, there was only the Hebrew faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and paganism. Over on the other side of the world, in China and India, there were higher forms of religion. and higher forms of civilization. But on our side of the world, from the Near East on, there was only the paganism of Rome, of Greece, and whatever there was on the European continent, and there certainly wasn't very much, because 55 BC, when Caesar presumably landed in Gaul or England, there was just barbarism there, almost cannibalism. The history of Europe, the pre-Christian history, is one of primitive peoples. And the history of Rome and Greece is that of pagans. So that, and of course Egypt, so that only with the beginning of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the Hebrew prophets did we have any religion of one God, of anything that approached what we call the religious life. Now, that life, that religion, consisted of the law, and it functioned through law. The major backbone of it was the Ten Commandments. If you obeyed those 10 commandments, you were as fine a type of citizen as could be demanded of you, and in addition to that, you were, if you also obeyed the dietetic laws and a few other customs, you were a good Hebrew. Now, there wasn't anything said there about being spiritual. There wasn't anything said there about any form of a religion that would embrace what we today know as love. It was law, strictly law. When you disobeyed that law, the best you could hope for was to be stoned, excommunicated. And so you must understand that the first of our modern religions, which is the Hebrew faith, is a religion of law, and in no wise indicates, even though you are accepted as a perfect Jew, perfect Hebrew, perfect member of the religious faith, no indication there of a spiritual nature, just obedience to the law. Now, Jesus, whose name incidentally never was Jesus, as you know, but Yeshua was a Hebrew rabbi in the Hebrew organized church, authorized to speak from its platform, to preach from its platform, and you'll find reference to that in the New Testament. But he went right up on the platform on Saturday, on Sabbath, and preached. He didn't preach Christianity, there wasn't any. He didn't preach to Christians, there weren't any. He was a Hebrew rabbi preaching to Hebrews. But now watch the miracle. This man, and for our purpose at this moment, it is not important where or when or how this great light descended upon him, because at the present time, as these scrolls are being translated in Israel, I'm sure that the true history of how and when the light came to him will be revealed. But until such time, or until these scrolls are released, we have no way of knowing when it was, how it was, or through whom that this light came to him. The most that is known now is a confirmation of what has been suspected for many years, that he was a member of the Essenes. And I believe it's well established already that he was not only a member, but he was the actual head of the Essenes. Now, whether his illumination came through that connection, or whether that connection came through his illumination, isn't the important thing. The important thing that I would like to convey to you is this: that he received an illumination that gave him an entirely new religious teaching, something that heretofore was entirely unknown to the Hebrews. And the sad part was that as he revealed this new faith, this new teaching to men, it made them free, which of course the church couldn't tolerate, because the church said, if you do not come to Jerusalem once a year and bring your tithes and gifts and so forth, of course you can't go to heaven and you can't be a good Jew. And it also said that if you didn't tithe the rest of the year and bring the best of your flocks and so forth and so on, you couldn't be a good Jew, a good Hebrew. And he brought to light that that wasn't true at all. Not at all. That your spiritual welfare had nothing to do with what you did with your money. It had to do with the state of consciousness that you developed. And he revealed that in such statements as, my kingdom is not of this world. He also revealed it in his teaching on prayer, that you are not to pray for what you shall eat or what you shall drink or wherewithal you shall be clothed. That your prayer must only be the seeking of the kingdom of God, my kingdom, this other dimension, and that finding it, all these things are added unto you. In other words, he taught a new dimension of life, a higher consciousness, and the necessity for dying to your old beliefs. In fact, it's very clear that you cannot add new wine to old bottles. And he was trying to tell these Hebrews that you cannot be a good Hebrew and add to it Christianity. You will have to leave one for the other, for they contradict each other. Now, in probably the most famous writing that has ever achieved print, probably the greatest message ever to be given to mankind, before or since, is the Sermon on the Mount. Because in the Sermon on the Mount, he sums up the difference between Judaism and this new teaching of his, which is not yet known as Christianity. It is merely known as the teaching of a Hebrew rabbi, an independent and a radical. It is not yet Christianity. He sums it up in the Sermon on the Mount, and he does it in this way. He says, ye have heard it said of old. And then he tells you the Hebrew teaching. And then after he has given you the Hebrew teaching, he says, but I say unto you. But I say unto you. In other words, that's the way it was, but that's old wine. Get it out of your bottles, or get rid of the bottles entirely, because I'm going to give you a new wine, and you're going to need a new bottle, a new state of consciousness. And what is it that ye heard of old? Well, you just heard that if a man cheated you, to cheat him twice as hard, or if a man sued you, sue him twice as hard. If a man hit you, hit him twice as hard. Whatever was done to you, you do it back, only do it twice as much, and probably beat him to it if you can. In other words, the whole idea is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Always defend yourself, always protect yourself, and always assert your rights, and always stand up for your rights and see that you get them. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, and then here the three greatest words that have ever been put into one statement. resist not evil. Now, on those three words, that which is called Christianity is built. Resist not evil, and then he becomes very specific and tells you that if somebody takes one thing away from you, let him have two. If you're sued for one thing, let him have two. Don't resist, don't resent, don't get back at, don't assert your rights, but let the other fellow do anything to you he wants. Sounds at first like appeasement. Sounds at first like being weak-kneed. But it turns out later that it's the greatest strength ever been known. Why? Because the moment that you do not resist, an invisible presence and power comes along to do it for you in its own way. In other words, now you have said heretofore that there's a God, but you've never proved it, nor have you relied on it. But now we are not going to rely on the ordinary human means of defense, but on something so transcendental that even the master can't explain it. He can only say, resist not evil, and the evil will flee from you. But actually, it's more than that. Actually, when you give up, it takes over. And whatever the name or the nature of the evil, it is dissolved. Now, the Master taught and preached and demonstrated his teaching for 3 years. During that time, he proved beyond doubt to the multitudes of his day that there is an invisible something which he called the Father within me, your Father and my Father. Later, Paul, in teaching it, gave it a different name, the Christ. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. He didn't mean Jesus, even though that interpretation has been put on it later. But he didn't mean that because he knew in those days that Christ didn't mean Jesus. Christ was a spirit, not a man. And he knew that that teaching of Jesus was about the Christ, the Spirit of God in man, the Son of God in man. And so Paul meant that this Spirit of God in man, which Jesus taught me, taught us, revealed to us, that's what I live by and through, and can do all things through. I of my own self can do nothing, said the Master. Paul revealed that he could do nothing of himself, but insofar as the Christ, this invisible presence and power, animated him, he could do all things. Now, the New Testament is fairly complete in the revelation of what the Master taught, but not as complete as it might be, because there must be many, many, many documents written during the Master's ministry and afterward that have not come to light, that could tell us more about this teaching, because it isn't possible that in 3 years the Master said only the little that is revealed in the 4 Gospels. If you take the duplications out of these Gospels, you'll find that there is not very much revealed. And there must have been more than that take place in those 3 years. But enough is there, especially in the Gospel of John, to reveal that there is a something called grace. there is a something called the Spirit of God, or the Christ, or the presence, or the Holy Ghost. There is a something that is not known to mortals and can never be known by mortals. A something which requires a spiritual state of consciousness to comprehend and to demonstrate. All through these scriptures it says that the things of God are foolishness with man, and that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, and many other such statements that show that the intellectual mind, our intellect, our reasoning mind, cannot grasp spiritual reality. Now, the question comes up there, does that mean that there are certain people set apart who can know and demonstrate spiritual reality, and are all others condemned to outer darkness? And the answer is no. No, just as anyone can master music or art or science in some degree, so it is that everyone can master, develop spiritual consciousness in some degree. Now, all are not going to be equal. This thing about all men are created equal in our original documents here must be understood to be correct. When they say we're created equal, they do not necessarily remain equal. That is a matter of development. We are all created equal, but we all develop after our state of consciousness, which is brought on partly by prenatal influences, partly by environment, early environment, partly by education. By the time those three things get through with us, we aren't the person who was born. If you saw John Barrymore in his Shylock makeup, you'd never know that it was John Barrymore, because by the time he assumed the qualities of that character and its costume, he wasn't John Barrymore any moment, and probably had difficulty after 11 o'clock getting back to be John Barrymore. It is said of many actors, you know, that they forget when 11 o'clock comes. They can't get out of their character back into their selfhood. So it is with us. Regardless of what it is, what we were when we were born, remember that by the time the influence of our grandparents and our parents got to work on us, and then this environment as children, and then our education, we have become something far different than might have been the case had we developed according to our own likes and dislikes. Now, the point is that in these latter generations, the material side of us has been developed. The mechanical side. And we are the world's greatest when it comes to mechanics and to materialism. And the spiritual side has been neglected. And so there is far less of the spiritual in us than would be had we started in infancy to be developed along spiritual lines. But that doesn't mean that we do not possess the faculty to develop those spiritual qualities now, because we do. Anyone can, at any given moment, begin their spiritual career if something within them sets them on the path. If we have been turned so far away from spiritual living, we may not get back to it unless some great need comes up. That's where martyrdom and that's where problems have their place. In our age, if we were to go along healthy and with abundant supply and no wars on the horizon, we would all be so content and at peace in that there never would be an attempt to seek spiritual development. But I'm sure it's safe to say that 90% of us here in this room wouldn't be here if we weren't or hadn't been at some time or other driven by a physical, mental, moral, or financial need, or an inner unknown hunger to seek something higher than just a lot of health and a lot of money. If our problems drive us hard enough, we will be driven to the demonstration of spiritual consciousness. Now, the law came by Moses, and grace and truth by Jesus Christ. Now please understand that grace and truth must have some definite meaning separate and apart from what was meant by law. Because we have a man, undoubtedly the most illumined, most enlightened, most spiritually developed of any known. And in some miraculous way, the world almost revolves around the teachings of that man. And what are those teachings? Well, I say to you that the words grace and truth, understood, will reveal what they mean. Now, for 300 years, we have people all up and down the Holy Lands and crossing over into Rome and Greece, teaching and preaching not the law of the Hebrew faith, but a something new, a something startling, a something different, a something called grace and truth, but which came to be known as Christianity or Christian teaching. Now, the first followers of that were called Jewish Christians, because they were all Jews who were followers of the Christ, Jesus the Christ. And so they were Jewish Christians. And you undoubtedly know from the Bible that in those earliest days, in order to be a Christian, you had to first be a Jew. In other words, if you weren't fortunate enough to be a Jew in those days, a Hebrew, you had no chance to become a Christian, because they were God's chosen people, and only they probably were worthy of, at least it must have been thought so, of being Christians. But eventually the light dawned in the mind of Paul and of Peter, and it was realized that this Christ was something more than just a different form of Judaism, just more than an offshoot of Judaism. It was something separate and distinct of its own, and any man, regardless of his background, even the Gentiles, even the pagans of Rome and Greece, could, if they would, become Christians. And so it no longer became necessary to be a Hebrew in order to be a Christian, no longer became necessary to be circumcised in order to be a Christian, and the disciples began to preach to the Gentiles and to the pagans, and to acknowledge that this is something of a universal nature. There we get the first glimpse of the fact that Christianity is not Judaism. It is something entirely separate and apart from Judaism, something entirely different than Judaism. And as a matter of fact, if you really wanted to understand the Christian teaching, you'd better clean yourself out of your old Judaic beliefs. Now, that went on for 300 years. And then the strangest event that has ever happened in the world took place. A Christian church was organized that accepted Judaism 100% throughout all of the Christian teaching except the name of its revelator, adopted the pagan rites and rituals of the Egyptian and other pagans of the days, and call it a Christian church. It took the Old Testament bodily, literally, and added to it all of these rites and ceremonies, built them around a great character, and called it a Christian church. But now let's see what's happened to Christianity. Does it still teach resist not evil? No. No, it acknowledges the need for evil, and if you are smitten on one cheek, be sure that you smite the other fellow on his cheek. Only do it first if you can. And so it provides for armies, it provides for chaplains, it provides for the support of all forms of military structure. Not only that, but it certainly not only supports but uses the power of the courts, so that when they are sued, they don't give both the cloak and the vest, but they try to protect themselves from the loss of the cloak as well as the vest, and they stand on their rights. In other words, none of the grace and truth part of the Christian teaching has been brought into the Christian church. The law of Moses has been brought in, and the cosmic law of punishment has been brought in, only it has been changed from the way Jesus taught it and given the way the Hebrews gave it. Let me illustrate that for you. The Hebrews taught that if you disobey the law, you will be punished by God. God sits up there as a mighty judge, noting all the good you do and all the evil. The evil you quickly get punished for, and the good is set aside for some future reward. Now Jesus revealed that that's not true at all. God does not reward and God does not punish. And he taught that in the Sermon on the Mount, in that part of it which is cosmic law, that as you sin, you are punished by that sin. There isn't a reference in there to God punishing you. There isn't a reference to God, either in this world or the next, punishing you. It is always clearly revealed that as ye do unto others, it will be done unto you, not by God. That as ye sow, so shall ye reap. Has nothing to do with God. It has to do with a law under which all humans live, the cosmic law. Every human being in the world is living under a cosmic law, and there is no need in all this world of humans for a God to either punish or to reward. Your deed of love is reflected in love, and your evil deed is brought back to you in evil deeds by the very act itself. You set in motion both the good and the evil by your own state of consciousness. As ye measure it, as ye meet, it will be measured back unto you. Not by God, but by the law. Moses gave you the law. It's a cosmic law. And that states definitely that as ye sow, so shall ye reap, by virtue of the law that you are invoking. When you hate, you are invoking a law. When you love, you are invoking a law. When you give or share, you are invoking a law. When you hold, you are invoking a law. If you don't believe it, just take any of these trees out here and let the fruit grow on them and don't pluck it. And just see how quickly the trees will stop bearing. And don't blame God for that. God isn't punishing a tree. Always the tree must yield up its fruit in order that it may have more crops. Always, unless we yield up good, we become barren. It's a law. This law is in operation whether you're a Hebrew, a Christian, Mohammedan, or whatnot. It is a law that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. All you have to do is watch the history, study the history of the nations of the world, and see what's happened to them in proportion as they have strayed from the golden rule. It happens to individuals, it happens to nations, and there is no way to avoid the penalty of wrongdoing. There is no way. Not that there's any God going to do anything about it, but because there is a cosmic law that you set in operation. And with whatever measure you meet, it will be measured unto you, pressed down and running over, for either good or evil. Now, the Master revealed that in the Sermon on the Mount, in that part of his teaching where he said, ye have heard it said of old. But of course there are other parts of the Old Testament where God gets the blame for all of our evils, and God is punishing us. That the Master never said. He never said that God punished the man on the cross with him, the thief. He never said that God punished the woman taken in adultery. He never said that God was punishing the blind. Always it was, go and sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. You're doing it, not God. But the Hebrews taught that God did it. It's so easy to blame somebody else. And when the church was organized, it wasn't the teaching of cosmic law that Jesus gave the world that they adopted, but the Hebrew teaching that God punishes you. And you see the result of that is you have to lose your way, because there is no visible God. And pretty soon you get the idea, more especially from observation, and probably from some little errors that we ourselves commit. Why, there isn't any punishment. God didn't do a thing about it. And we ultimately come to where society is now, that we're not so sure that God is going to punish our evils, and so we do these evils. Mankind, the world at large, is doing plenty of evils, which it only does because it has taught them that God will punish it, and they don't believe that, because there isn't any visible God around. If men were taught that the evil deed itself punished them, they would be back in the Master Christ Jesus teaching on that subject of cosmic law, and then they would be ready for his higher teaching of how to overcome cosmic law. Because you see, it is possible to set aside cosmic law, wipe out all the punishments for our former misdeeds, and go on. But that cannot happen to you individually or to the world until the nature of cosmic law is first learned, which is law as taught by the Master, in that the deed itself, and not necessarily the physical deed. Remember, I told you last night, this is a mental universe that we're living in. The physical is only the outer expression of the mental. And so therefore it is not necessary to steal in order to be punished for theft. It is only necessary to think of stealing, or not even of stealing, merely desiring that which somebody else has. It isn't enough. It isn't necessary to commit adultery. It is only necessary to long, to desire. It isn't necessary to actually strike somebody. Merely to get angry at them is enough to send the law back upon us. Now the world in its grosser state does not feel that as much as those who are on the spiritual path. I can assure you that those on the spiritual path suffer more for a tiny infraction than the ordinary person does from a major one. Because by the time you're on the spiritual path, you know what's right and wrong, and so every tiny infraction of it sets up this law in operation against you. Now, setting aside cosmic law involves, first of all, the recognition that it exists, that the evil that I think or do reacts upon me, and immediately sets me free from blaming anybody in all this world, or any set of circumstances or conditions. It teaches me that I alone am responsible, that there isn't even a mysterious God somewhere, that I myself determine the issues of life by understanding that I have set in motion the good and the evils that befall me by my own state of consciousness. That enables us to withdraw the gaze from the world and from people, stop blaming them, condemning them, or wishing that we had help from them, and sets us up to the realization that something must take place within me. Jesus gave us the cue when he said, "Go and sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." We know now that we have to begin to change the state of consciousness that made it possible for us to carelessly, thoughtlessly, sometimes willfully do wrong. And the moment we realize that, we begin to perceive that there is a Father within us, a state of grace, a divine presence, and we, I think, very quickly learn what Paul learned, that there are two of us. Each one of us is a dual person. The good I would not, the good I would, that I do not. The evil that I would not, that I do. There's two of us warring with each other. Later Paul even says, it isn't I that sin, even when I sin. There's a sense of sin in me. We quickly learn that there's two of us. One that knows the right, and the other that's struggling against it. One that wants to be the perfect Superman, and the other one who through limitation, one thing or another, cannot achieve it. When we come to the place of realizing that, our salvation is very nigh, because now we ourselves can bear witness to the fact that there is a Son of God in me, or that I, in one phase of my identity, am the Son of God, but that Son of Man is still struggling in there. That Son of Man it is that must die daily to the human sense of existence. And so it is that we're taught about the warfare between the flesh and the spirit, the warfare between our true self and our human identity, that character whose costume we wear and whom we think to be ourselves. Now, once you acknowledge, as the Master did, that I can of my own self do nothing, the Father within me doeth the works, you will be on the path. You will know that there is a you born into the flesh, of fleshly tendencies, meaning a personal sense of self, and that your human life and career has been dedicated to that human sense of self. But now you realize there is a Father within me, a higher identity, the Christ self, and the goal of life now becomes attaining the conscious awareness of that identity, or, as it is put in mystical literature, conscious union with God, so that the small self disappears and the pure self remains intact as one's identity. In the case of the Master, there is no doubt that he achieved that conscious union in his meditations, and that after the resurrection he attained it in its fullness and perpetually. as a perpetual experience. But up to that time, it was necessary that he would go away for 40 days now and then to commune with this inner self, to rise to that height of true identity, and then come down to the valleys and heal the multitudes. And then go back up again to seek that light and that inspiration. Now, the infinite way is the double teaching of the Master. It teaches cosmic law. It teaches that you need not fear God's punishment, but also you must not look to God for any reward. That you yourself, as a human being, must set in force the laws that govern you. You yourself must begin to abide by the teachings, I'm speaking literally now, of the Master. Love thy neighbor as thyself, or starting with the first one, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul. That love of God is not an emotional experience. Too many students write me that they don't feel that love. I don't know that there's anything to feel in that love. I don't think it's so much a matter of feeling. It's a matter of understanding. Once you understand that God is the principle of all real life and existence, and that God is the creative principle, the maintaining and the sustaining principle, that God in our true being is the Father within that governs us spiritually, harmoniously, and perfectly, you are loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Then, as you begin to lose fear of the creature, that again Paul gave to us, that many love the creature more than the Creator, the visible more than the invisible. Now, as you begin to learn to use the visible and enjoy the visible, but not worship it, understand always that the invisible, right where you are, is holy ground. And the invisible, where you are, is the substance, law, and cause of all that's to become visible in your life. Put your whole faith and confidence in the fact that if you were alone in a desert and lost, or out in the ocean in a rubber boat, that the invisible of you would carry you through. And then you can really say, I'm not looking for a man whose breath is in his nostril, for where is he to be accounted of? I'm looking only to this infinite invisible to appear outwardly and visibly as the oasis in the desert or the rescuers at sea. You are then loving God supremely with all the heart, with all the soul, with all the mind. As you can learn to live with the visible or without it, enjoy it or not, always resting back in the realization that the infinite invisible is the cause, the substance of all that is, and all that I shall ever need. And if this whole outer world collapses, I will still have God to stand on, the invisible. Then you are demonstrating your supreme love of God. To love thy neighbor as thyself is, first of all, to be able inwardly to know that the Son of God is an invisible being, but that the Son of God is the true identity of every individual on the face of the globe. And that means instantly that you have to die to all prejudice, bigotry, bias. And not only that, it means that you have to spend more time praying for the evil than you do for the good. You have to spend more time praying for the enemy than you do for your friend. For if you love your neighbor as yourself, you'll realize that the person who is your friend and who is already partly good at least needs far less of your prayers than the person who's wholly evil or who is an enemy. We cannot be enemies of anyone, regardless of how erroneous we believe their course of life may be, because the Master never taught that we must be stupid. Certainly, if a person is indulging wrong, whether it is a political wrong, a moral wrong, an economic wrong, we can certainly be intelligent enough to see the wrongness of it without pouncing on the person and hating them for it, but rather praying in order to lift them out of it. More especially if we ourselves have been lifted out in some measure. I haven't met anyone yet who is claiming that they have attained their ultimate perfection. So we probably all need some grace and prayer to help us along the path. But how much more do they need who have not yet become aware of the fact that the evil they're indulging is a stupidity, and more of a stupidity than anything else, because it is unnecessary. Now, the two major points of the infinite way teaching are these. The cosmic law, you have heard it said of old, which was revealed by the Master, and the state of grace and truth revealed in "But I say unto you." So that you start out with the idea of knowing that living under the law brings a reward or a punishment under the law, but that a living by grace frees you from the law. And then you'll find that there is neither reward nor punishment. There is neither punishment nor reward. There is neither good nor evil in the spiritual life. And so you come to that which started all this in the infinite way. And that is this. And this is how the infinite way had its beginning. As I told you last night, through grace, I started healing, but without any knowledge of what healed. When the teaching of the Master began to clarify itself in me, I saw this light. You don't heal disease. You don't reform sin or sinners. You don't employ the unemployed. You don't enrich the poverty-stricken. That's nonsense. That is the use of one power over another power. I saw that you achieve an inner state of peace in which you do not battle evil, mentally or physically, not even spiritually. You don't even appeal to a God for help. You achieve this inner state of grace, and it appears outwardly as health, harmony, wholeness, completeness, perfection, and all that we call the things of life. Now, I couldn't understand the difficulty that friends, fellow practitioners were having, nor some of their statements about how difficult it was to meet this particular claim or that particular claim, because I didn't know what it was that was functioning in them, until one day one of these very good friends who knew something of my work met me on the street and said, "I have a case that I am not meeting. I wonder if you can help me with it." "What is it?" "Well, this person was formerly Jewish, and that Jewish thought is so strong that I can't bring out a healing. So I would like to know how you work against the Jewish thought." It's a fine thing to ask a person whose ancestors are all Jewish. I wasn't aware that there was anything harmful in their thought. They hadn't harmed me anyhow. Well, I don't even know what you're talking about. Well, you know it must be more difficult to heal the Jewish thought. You mean they're worse than the woman taken in adultery or the thief on the cross? No, I don't know anything about those things. Well, don't you have to work against those things? And then I saw the whole thing. I don't have to work against anything. I don't have to work against anybody. I don't have to work against any condition. All I have to do is attain an inner state of peace. I have nothing to do with who it is out here that is sick or sinful. Nothing at all. I've had beautiful work right up here in this mental institute. I've had beautiful work in mental institutes in the East. I have nothing to do with who the patient is or what's wrong with them. I've had just as much success with people who are unconscious as those who are conscious. I have nothing to do with them. Then I saw that healing work to many people is fighting evil. It's overcoming disease, or it's overcoming sin, or temper, or temperament. Well, that you might as well go to a psychologist and fail with them, because you're going to. They can't succeed. And let them fail with you. Don't go to a spiritual healer, because not with that kind of thing. A spiritual healer doesn't care what you think, or what you thought when you were a child, or what your parents thought. A spiritual healer doesn't care whether you were brought up in a good environment or a bad environment, because the spiritual healer nullifies law and does it through grace. Not through a power, just through grace. It isn't a right thought supplanting a wrong thought. It isn't a pure thought supplanting a guilty thought or a sinful thought. It isn't abundance supplanting lack. It's a state of grace being realized. That's Christianity. That is pure Christianity, and that is why you never have to preach sermons about sin and disease and death. You never have to preach sermons about punishment. It's enough just to make people acquainted with the fact that on the human level of life, the evil that you do is going to be returned to you, and the good you do is. Aside from that, you're through with the subject. When a person wants to be rid of their sins, diseases, and deaths, you don't preach sermons to them, and you don't try psychologically to make them better humans. Because if you succeed, you have merely turned one kind of a human into another, and they can turn right back again next week or next month or next year into something worse. You don't do that. In our work, in the infinite way, you take the teaching of Jesus Christ in all its literalness, and you bring about a state of grace that nullifies the human condition. Now, that is why the martyrs of old were willing to be thrown to the lions or burned at the stake. That is why they were willing to violate every law of the land in order to follow their teacher and their teaching, for the simple reason that they knew that they were free of the law, and neither lions nor fire could kill nor destroy. And their work had to go on and prove that very point. So it was in the early days of these very teachings that are covering this land today, Christian Science, out of which all of this began. Why, the early Christian Science practitioners went to prison by the dozens. State after state sent them to prison. Why not? They violated the law, or definite laws against healing, unless you employed a regular authorized materia medica who had a license to even bury you. All right, we're going to rest a while. Give our machines a rest, too.